Well, given the fact that I have a ton of doctor supplies and I'm wearing a shirt that has the crest of reliability on it, I'm definitely going to be talking about Joe. Um, couldn't exactly find the doctor's bag, so I just have a picture of a doctor's bag and a bunch of like first aid type stuff. Because in all honesty, if there's a Digidestin that you have to be near when there's a pandemic that strikes, you might as well be around Joe, because knowing Joe, he's very well prepared for this. Um, would have been very interesting to see how Joe would have reacted to COVID. Because Joe's always the one, of course, throughout the series, throughout the original series, that we see carrying around the first aid bag with a bunch of so many different first aid materials, bandages, tongue depressors for whatever reason, different types of things that are very useful for first aid, rubbing alcohol, disinfectant, a whole bunch of stuff like that. There's probably face masks in that bag. So this video is obviously going to be about Joe Kido, who is of course the Digidestin of reliability. And his Digimon is Bokomon. Well, Gomamon turns into Gomamon. I at one point had the piggy bank for Bokomon, but unfortunately it got lost a long time ago, and I'm still annoyed about it. I got a lot of grievances with my younger self. Well, why didn't you ever get that? Or, well, no, why did you misplace that? But of course, we have Joe, who's of course throughout the original season and the second season. And then of course, there's his Digimon is of course Bukamon. Bukamon turns into Gomamon, turns into Ikakumon, turns into Zuromon, turns into Vikamon. And that, of course, DNA digivolves with the rest to form Omnimon Merciful mode. And I'll be going over those, of course, evolutions as I go through the video. Joe's timeline basically starts, most like the rest of them, starts in 1995 when the attack or the battle between Parrotmon and Red Greymon happens in Heightened View Terrace. Joe is apparently supposedly seems to be living in the apartment directly above Mimi in this time frame, because we see them both in the same picture when they're both being scanned. And in the Digimon movie, he's like on the phone with Izzy, if I remember correctly, or at least in the English dub he was. I don't know if he was necessarily in the Japanese dub or not. But so he witnesses that, and he's one of course, the chosen children. And then in 1999, him and the rest of the original seven are, of course, whooshed off to the digital world from their summer camp. Joe is the one that, of course, freaks out the most when he lands. When they land in the digital world, and I love his reaction when he first joins the group again after he meets Bukamon, and he's like, this thing, it won't leave me alone, help. And like Bukamon's top pops up behind him. I'm not a thing, I'm a Digimon. And then, yeah, it's Bukamon and Joe. Gomamon and Joe very much balance each other out. And that works very well for the two of them. Of course, I have all the doctor stuff because, of course, Joe's goal throughout the entire series is to become a doctor. This becomes very prevalent in Digimon Tri and then in Digimon The Last Evolution. He unfortunately also has a lot of pressure from his parents to do this as well, unfortunately, which I'll go over a bit more when I go over Joe's relationships. His brother seems to be rather supportive of him, but again, I'll go over those a little bit later. They, of course, they have to fight Kawagamon, and then, of course, all the Digimon digivolve into their rookie forms, and then he gets Gomamon for the first time, and then they end up, they travel around, all the rest of the Digimon, they all digivolve at some point into their champion forms. And at one point, Joe kind of feels like he's a little more of a liability, I guess. He keeps trying to find humans that can help them in this, in this strange world, and it doesn't work. He doesn't like that the younger ones are very reckless and everything like that. And he cannot, he keeps trying to settle arguments between Ty and Matt about climbing this giant mountain that's called Infinity Mountain that's at the middle of the island. Infinity, on top of Infinity Mountain, I think, if I remember correctly, is where Devimon lives anyway, so they have to go there at some point. But Joe, one night, before Gomamon has digivolved any further, Sora's digivolved, Agumon's digivolved, Gabumon, Sora has digivolved. I think Palmon has digivolved too, but I'll be doing Mimi's video next. But we get Joe and Gomamon go up the mountain to try to find what else they can learn about the black gears and everything before the rest of the group does, just because Joe wants to feel more like he can help. And what ends up happening is they end up interacting with a Digimon that's called Unimon, which it just aesthetically, it's a unicorn. Why? It's a like a Pegasus type unicorn thing. Why wouldn't I like it? So that he ends up getting attacked by Unimon. In Unimon's defense, it has a black gear in it from Devimon, so it's not doing that of its own volition. And he shows, Tai and Sora show up to help Joe, and their Digimon are defeated by Unimon. Greymon and Birdramon are defeated. And then this is the moment when Joe Joe and Gomamon, connect enough that Gomamon is able to digivolve, and he digivolves into Ikakamon for the first time. And he, destroys the black gear inside of Unimon and saves them all from that. And I think also there's like a whole bunch of black gears in the mountain. And like they attack the black gears in the mountain just because it causes more problems for Devimon, because it's less black gears that he can use. Admittedly, at this point, I don't know if they know about Devimon. And then, of course, when they're all separated by Devimon, Joe and Sora, of course, end up at the, they end up at the Bakumon village. And what had happened was Joe had landed in the middle of the sea, and he, can't swim. And Gomamon's trying to save him, and Sora's fishing, and Gomamon grabs a fishing wire and loops it around Joe, and then Sora saves them by pulling them out. And of course, they end up in the Bakumon village, and they're almost eaten by the Bakumon, and of course, then Ikakamon and Birdramon save them. And they, Joe makes up the chant, the Bakumon lose your power, Bakumon lose your power, that that they use to, defeat the Bakumon. And then, of course, they're all together again when they have to fight Devimon. And, of course, Joe witnesses what happens with, Anjumon defeating Devimon and TK losing Patamon. And then, of course, has the egg. And then, of course, they meet Genai in his hologram form. I don't remember if Joe was initially very wary of Genai or not. I think he's just kind of happy to see another kind of human thing in this world. That's not a Digimon, because Genai is definitely not a Digimon. Genai is going to get his own video at some point, just with how much we learn about Genai throughout the course of the series. But one of the things, so they end up traveling to Server, of course, and they all get their crest. Joe's is, I think, the second crest that they find, because they find his crest when they're dealing with the battle that ends up resulting in Skull Greymon, and they find his crest, and it helps them escape. Because the crests are each in different places, and the Digidestined, of course, have to each find the crest. Matt or Ty finds his rather quickly. Joe's the second one, and usually if the crest, wherever the crest is, when it is found by the right person, it kind of disappears and makes a hole, and you can go through the hole to get to a part of a wall disappears or something like that. Or in the case of Mimi, it pops out of a giant cactus at some point, which is just funny. And so they travel a bit as they're dealing with Edamon, of course, and then, of course, when they deal with Datamon, and when Metal Greymon, comes into being, when Tai digivolves, and Greymon digivolves into Metal Greymon for the first time, of course. Then, of course, there's a giant wormhole that opens up, and Tai and Metal Greymon get sucked through that, and then Joe and the rest of the group are left in the digital world, and Joe leaves this group to go and search for Ty, because he kind of thinks, well, maybe Ty's still in the digital world somewhere, and we just have to find them. Of course, they all end up going their separate little ways. And Joe ends up at a restaurant that is run by a Digimon that's called it's Vegemon, are like little, like the waiters in the restaurant, and then there's for Digitamamon. Digitamamon is the the owner of the restaurant, kind of also kind of the chef type thing of the restaurant. But he's there, and of course he's trying to keep Joe there. And then at one point, Matt shows up because he's trying to find the rest of the group, and he finds Joe first at the restaurant. And kind of the way that Digitamamon has like tricked Joe into doing this is that like he's like, well, Joe and Gomamon ate a whole bunch of stuff, and he's like, well, the type of money you use, I don't take. So you're gonna have to work it off in the kitchen. And then they just keep compiling more and more debt onto Joe. And then of course Matt and Gabumon show up, and as I mentioned, this is in the time frame when Matt activates his his crest of friendship. Of course, when this whole incident happens, Matt is of course trying to protect Joe because Digitamamon keeps threatening Joe to Matt. Like, behind Joe's back, he keeps threatening him in front of Matt. And, Matt wants to protect Joe because he doesn't want Joe to get hurt. But Joe, Digitamamon and Devimon just keep causing more and more problems for Joe and for Matt, just to make that debt get bigger and bigger. And, Sora kind of helps in the background a little bit as much as she can to try to, minimize some of the damage without getting spotted, as I went over in her video. And then, Ty and TK show up, and then of course, Vegemon, attacks Matt and Joe, and this is when Matt's, when his crest activates, and he gets Were Garurumon, of course, and then they defeat Digitamamon and Vegemon, and they're all free to go now. And of course Joe and Matt are friends again. Of course, not that they were ever not friends, it's just Matt kept getting very, very frustrated with Joe. And then of course they travel, they find the rest of the group again, and then of course they have to deal with Myotismon, and then they meet Genai again, and then they have to go back to the real world. And while they're in the real world, Joe and TK both live in a slightly different area than the rest of the group. The rest of the group all kind of live within one general area. I think it's in the place called Odaiba, if I remember correctly. I could be mispronouncing, or I could just misremember the certain specific locations in that. But it's in a place, and I'm just going to call it Odaiba because, it's Odaiba. And that's where Myotismon is kind of based out of. Joe and TK actually live on like the other side of the river from this area, because TK of course lives off with his mom, because Matt and their dad live in Odaiba because their dad runs the Odaiba like TV station. And then of course TK and their mom live on the other side of the river. And Joe lives over in that area as well with his parents and his brothers. It's left up for debate. I'll talk about that. That's a bit of a confusing thing. But what ends up happening is, of course, all the rest of the group, like, they all bring in, like, their, because they're all trying, one of the things that they do that just kind of messes with Joe is at one point they end up all bringing in, like, their different class books that talk, from, like, when they were from back in 1995, when they were in, like, whatever grade that was in, they all bring in their different class books that talk about, all the different listings of, like, who their friends were, who were their classmates at the time, because they're like, well, maybe one of these kids is the other, the 8th Digidestin that we're trying to look for. And they all give their books to Matt, or to Joe. And then Joe, ends up going home and, like, having to call, like, every single one of them. And, like, like, the ones that are in his book would be one thing if he's calling them up and trying to talk to them. If, like, it's a complete stranger, that doesn't go so well for Joe, unfortunately. He doesn't they don't find it that way, of course, because he is Digidestin as Kari. And then later on, when Myotismon spreads out his fog, his digifog all over the area that cuts off the communication, Joe and TK both know that they have to get through the fog to go and help their friends in Odaiba. And what ends up happening is Joe digivolves, Gomamon digivolves into Ikakumon because he can swim through, and because that's he's basically like a giant walrus type thing. I always like Ikakumon. He's fun. And what ends up happening is, of course, TK goes with Joe. TK's mom is like, "Where are you going?" Because like she's at the dock with him. She's like, "Where are you going?" And Joe's like, "Don't worry, Mrs. whatever the heck TK's last name was. I'll keep TK safe. It's okay." We were partners in shop class at camp. He almost cut my finger off, but that's for a different time. I love you, Joe. Oversharing much. But they work their way through that, and while they're going through, they end up getting attacked by a Mega Seadramon. Who, they dealt with a Seadramon earlier. There's a Mega Seadramon Dao. Metal Seadramon is one of the Dark Masters, of course. But they have to fight Mega Seadramon. And unfortunately, Joe and TK get knocked off of the back of Ikakumon, and Joe is trying to save TK, but of course he ends up kind of drowning in the process because he's trying to protect TK. And in that process, that results in Joe's crest of reliability activating, and that results in Zudomon Ikakumon digivolving into Zudomon. And he gets a nice big hammer and a giant shell on his back that looks like a combination of like a like walrus and a turtle and Thor. I got Thor's helmet back here. I don't unfortunately have a Thor's hammer at the moment. I need to get one of those. But so they end up Zudomon Ikakumon digivolves into Zudomon, and he defeats Mega Seadramon, and he saves Joe and TK, and like TK's mom is in the background like watching this like, what the frick is going on? And Joe and TK are making their way into Odaiba, and of course they find the TV station where Myotismon is based, and they actually find Wizardmon floating in the river. On their way in, they find Wizardmon, and he's holding on to Kari's crest. And they don't quite realize they haven't quite figured out that Wizardmon is a friend now, because of course they don't know about what happened with Tai and Kari and Gomamon and everything yet. But Wizardmon explains it to them, and then of course they find Sora and Matt and their Digimon, and then they go to the TV station where they help fight Myotismon, and where they witness everything that happens with Kari and Gomamon turning into Anjulamon, and then of course we get Myotismon's defeated, and then the rest of the group kind of spread out, and Joe goes back to his house because they have like a little bit of like a respite time between when they defeat Myotismon and when he wakes back up again and turns into Venom Myotismon. Joe goes back to his house where he ends up finding his brother Jim. Jim was, for some reason, able to hide from the Bakumon because he was asleep in the closet, which is kind of like a closet bunk bed type thing. Which, I mean, it's a great storage space area if you have a closet. I mean, sure. If you have a closet that's big enough to have a bed in it, I mean, bunk bed type thing, sure, whatever. But so he finds Joe, and they talk, and they go back to the community center TV station city area, where a bunch of the adults are still asleep, and Joe and Jim at this point he's a bit older than Joe. I think he's either in late high school going into college, or he's already in college. I don't remember exactly which. But he's like, looking over the rest of the, looking over a bunch of the adults, and like, well, the adults are all chanting at this point in time because kind of a spell from Venom Myotismon. It's supposed to keep them chanting. It's part of the prophecy about the angels of light and hope and everything. And, Jim is like looking them over, and they're talking about the fact that, Jim, their dad wants, him, Joe and Jim to become doctors. And Jim ends up saying, well, you know, becoming a doctor is what dad's dream for you is, but what do you really want to do? You know, do you want to become a doctor or do you want to do something else? Um, you know, that whole thing of, you know, the brother that's trying to, you know, the older brother that knows what type of pressure they're under from their parents, but, you know, wants to, wants to make sure that his younger brother is going to be happy in what he chooses to do. And, spoiler alert, Joe becomes a doctor. No, that's not really a spoiler alert. Um, if you've seen the ending of Digimon season 2, it's not a spoiler. And if you're watching these and you haven't seen the ending of Digimon Adventures 2.0 and Try and Last Evolution, go watch those, then come back and finish watching these videos. I'll wait. But, you know, what ends up happening is, you know, they deal with Venom Iotismon, they defeat him, and then, of course, they have to, you know, rainbow travel off to the digital world again to deal with the Dark Masters. Joe's brother Jim is, of course, there, wishing him luck, rooting him on. We don't really see Joe or Jim's parents throughout the first season. We get flashes of them in, like, Digimon Try, but we don't really get too much else with them. We do kind of know that there's that pressure there, of course. And this is where things kind of go a little bit different for what happens with Joe and what happens with the rest of the group. And like Mimi's off with Joe. But what ends up happening is, you know, they deal with Mega Seadramon or Metal Seadramon as one of the first Dark Masters that they deal with. And then unfortunately they lose their friends Waymon and Pixiemon. Waymon was this giant whale Digimon that they met at one point. He was very nice. They deal with him. They defeat Metal Seadramon, and Mimi ends up kind of, and I'll go over this in Mimi's video, of course, but Mimi kind of loses the will to fight. And because, you know, she sees her friends dying, they lost Wizardmon already. There were a couple of other Digimon that unfortunately they saw that got lost, or that got, you know, destroyed in the, friends that they lost in the time frame. And she doesn't want to lose any more friends, whether they be her, you know, the Digimon that are their friends, or whether they be like her actual, you know, the rest of the Digi-Destined or their Digimon. She doesn't want to see any more of them die. And, you know, they kind of know about Primary Village at this point in time, because TK visited Primary Village when they were all split up on File Island, but, you know, it's still that time frame of, well, we don't want to lose any more friends type of thing. And Mimi stays kind of put, and Joe ends up staying with her, because he's like, well, Mimi can't be on her own, and I'll stay here, and I'll stay here and help keep Mimi safe. And they end up encountering a wounded Ogremon, who, of course, way back at the beginning of the series, Ogremon was, you know, one of Devimon's henchmen, and Joe ends up giving Ogremon first aid at Mimi's request. And, you know, Ogremon at one point, Ogremon's kind of had a bit of a change of heart at this point in time. He doesn't want to do the bad stuff like what Devimon was trying to make them do. He doesn't want to do that anymore. He still, of course, has his rivalry with Leomon, but he doesn't want to, like, attack the Digi-Destined anymore, and I don't think he wants to cause any more pain to his fellow Digimon necessarily, beyond his rivalry with Leomon. But what ends up happening is the group, Joe and Ogremon kind of have a bit of a heart-to-heart. And it's kind of a nice moment. Joe is kind of talking about the fact that he doesn't want to be useless in regards to, he wants to keep Mimi safe, but he also wants to be able to help the rest of their friends, and, you know, he wants to help save the digital world, of course. And, you know, I think Ogremon kind of commends him on that, but he's like, you know, you're a very frail human type thing, and, you know, the fact that you want to do that is very admirable, but put some meat on your bones type of thing. I don't remember the exact conversation, but they do that. And then, of course, the group is attacked by Metal Edamon, because, as I mentioned, Edamon, back when, I think I mentioned this in either Ty or Sora's video, because I talked about Edamon in a bunch of the videos, but Edamon, when everything happened with Datamon and Metal Greymon, and Tai activating his crest and everything, there was this giant ball of metal and dark network energy. It was like Edamon had like this giant dark network all over the continent of server that he was using to monitoring things and control the Digimon, like keep them in fear. And what ends up happening is, when that giant wormhole opened up, Edamon kind of got sucked into it with all this, evil data, metal, wire, network type stuff. And he got sucked into that and kind of like shot off into the universe or whatever. And now he's returned and he has evolved into Metal Edamon. And he's even more of an Elvis enthusiast, which again, if that was just something that they did for the dub, I'm fine with that. If it was something that was intentional in the Japanese, then, I'm okay with this. But he shows up and he starts attacking Joe and Mimi and Ogremon and, the random Digimon that are in the forest. And they end up saved by a Digimon that is called Saber Leomon. And Ogremon explains, that's Leomon. Your friend back from File Island? Yeah, that's him. And, Joe and Mimi are, of course, very happy to see Leomon because, de-digivolved, and he explains, well, being exposed to the light of the Digivices allows me to be able to digivolve, and now I can turn into Saber Leomon when I need to. And, Mimi and Joe are, of course, very, very happy to see Leomon. Even Ogremon's kind of happy to see Leomon. But what ended up happening is, Metal Edamon came back and started attacking them again. He kind of got scared off a little bit by Saber Leomon, but he comes back and they end up battling again. And what ends up happening is, unfortunately, Saber Leomon jumps over an attack that's aimed for Mimi, and he takes the brunt of the attack so Mimi doesn't get hurt. And unfortunately, this, of course, fatally wounds Saber Leomon. And, the Zudomon, Joe, of course, activates his crest, and Zudomon comes into being again, of course, and he, his Digi Hammer is made of, the same type of metal or whatever that Metal Edamon is made out of now. And it's like, to put it in comic book terms, it's like Wolverine claws versus Cap shield. Type thing, that adamantium versus vibranium type stuff. That type of concept there. Two opposing objects that are both equally hard and strong, blah, 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 blah. And Zudomon defeats Metal Edamon, and he's bye-bye. But then, unfortunately, Joe doesn't have anything that he can use to help heal Saber Leomon. And unfortunately, Leomon, sacrificed himself in order to save Mimi. And unfortunately, this results in, Leomon's gone, and of course, Joe, one of the moments where we see Joe kind of break down, and he's like, he grabs the first aid bag and he throws it aside, and he's like, what use is any of this stuff right now if it can't even help me save my friend? Type thing. And it is, it's like they've lost, that is one of the things that happens throughout Digimon, is they do lose a lot of friends. I mean, they literally lose Leomon twice because he pops up again in Digimon Tri, and they lose him again there because of the virus and Mekumon, unfortunately. But, it's like they lose Leomon, and of course, Mimi still, kind of doesn't have her will to fight yet, but she's decided that she wants to find the rest of their Digimon friends. They start gathering up a bunch of their other friends. They find Marimon, they find Frigimon, they find the Geckomon, and the, whatever the other Digimon are that were, like, worshipping Mimi as a princess. They find them, they find Unimon. I think Unimon shows up to help them. And like they're finding a bunch of these, their friend Digimon that they want to have, help them, of course, be able to fight against the Dark Masters, because all the Digimon want their homes back, of course. And, the Digidestined are their friends, and Ogremon's still with the group. And Joe ends up leaving at one point because they also end up at Primary Village, and Joe and, they meet Electmon, who's at Primary Village, who's TK's friend from earlier. Go over that in TK's video. But, they find Electmon, and they learn that until until the Dark Masters are defeated, Primary Village can't be healed and the rest in Digimon can't be reborn yet. But Electmon explains, yes, but once all the Dark Masters are defeated and the digital world can reform, then the primary village will be the first one to come back, and then then all the other Digimon can be reborn. And Electmon actually has Matt's harmonica, and Joe asked Electmon where he got it, and he's like, well, I found it over here on the whatever the lake shore, and there had been a boat that looked like a swan, because Matt likes to travel via swan boat, which is just funny. Went that way, however many days ago, and Joe decides that he's going to go off and he's going to try to find Matt, because they need to all be together to be able to defeat the rest of the Dark Masters and everything. And he's like, Matt's been on his own long enough. I got to go find him. And Joe goes off to find him, leaving Mimi with the rest of their friends to go and make her way to Spiral Mountain, which is where all the where Piedmon lives, at the top of Spiral Mountain, where the final battle takes place. And Matt does find Joe and returns with harmonica, and then they find TK and Sora, and of course they help. Matt and Joe are able to help Sora escape the dark pit, the depression dark pit that she's fallen into. They reunite with the rest. They deal with the whole battle with Piedmon, where they all get turned into keychains. Gomamon helps Sora get, Matt's keychain to TK. And then, of course, they defeat Piedmon. And then, of course, they deal with Apocalypse, which is just fun. And then, of course, we get the moments where they're all having to, after they defeat Apocalypse, and, Primary Village is now able to be reborn, and all the Digimon can be safe again. Yay! But what ends up happening is, of course, Jedi explains, well, you got a certain amount of time before the Digigates close forever, and you all got to say goodbye, and then take this train car that I stole and take it back to, drop it back off in the real world for me, because Jedi is apparently a kleptomaniac. But Joe and the rest of the group are all, of course, saying goodbye to their Digimon, and Joe's saying goodbye to Gomamon. And they're sitting by this like little lake area, and they're just talking, and they're like, well, let's shake hands. And I don't know if it was just because like they never shook hands or whatever, but like they shake hands, and he's like, Joe like looks at Gomamon, and he's like, you got a good grip for someone that doesn't actually have a hand. And all the Digidestined go back to the real world. And then, of course, in 2000, of course, when they deal with Diaboromon, Joe is actually off doing cram school during the entire battle, and I don't think he ever hears about it until after it's all finished. But yeah, he's off at cram school, which is funny. We get little glimpses of him at cram school, and like the timer that Diaboromon set up messed with like the timer in regards to like Matt's or like Joe's cram school testing that he's trying to do. And then in the summer in between or whatever, the group go back to the digital world, and they have to give up their crests in order to revitalize the barrier for the digital world, and they get to see their Digimon again, but they also kind of have to say goodbye to a part of their Digimon. And then, of course, by the time 2002, for where Digimon Adventure 2.0 comes into play, Joe is currently studying. His studying has paid off, and he is now at a private school, where he's busy studying, for the high school exams, entrance exams. They have it as like college entrance exams in the dub, but it's high school entrance exams to still so he can get into get to become a doctor. He doesn't have a lot of spare times, but he keeps up with the Digidestined, of course, with his friends and the new Digidestined. And after Ty gets back from the digital world the first time, where Davis, or is found out about Davis and the new Digidestined and everything. Joe's at the park where they all get together. And he, they all hear about what Joe's telling them, about what Ty's telling them about, there's, Davis now has his power and blah, 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 blah. And, Joe's, attending the cram school every day, of course, preparing for exams, but he, of course, still wants to stay informed about what's going on, because he's, of course, worried about Gomamon and the rest of the Digimon. And Joe and Gomamon do get reunited. What ends up happening is The Digimon Emperor is, of course, abusing a whole bunch of Gizamon, and he's using, his, Digimon Emperor, the Dark Rings and the Control Spires and everything to control them to build things. And Gomamon tries to stop him. And so, props to Gomamon. Admittedly, as we stated, Gomamon and Joe are quite different. Gomamon is much more brash, much more outgoing, much more happy-go-lucky. Joe is not so much. But they still get, they balance each other out, as I said, which is funny. But Joe, Gomamon, he gets unfortunately beat up by the Digimon Emperor, and there's these like computer monitor, TV monitors like all over the place in the digital world, and like Gomamon was told by like one of the other Detsun Digimon, that if you can find one of these, you can use it to like send a message to your Digidestin. And he, touches it and he uses it to try to send a message out to Joe. And in the real world, Joe's Digivice goes off and he knows that it's Gomamon, and Izzy tracks it to where it's supposed to be, and Joe goes with the group into the digital world, into this very snowy, cold, icy region. And Joe is, of course, the one that's prepared. And he has like, well, here, I brought hand warmers and like a bunch of other stuff to help you keep everybody warm. And they're like, oh, yay, thank you, Joe. It's like they're cold. They're like holding on to the hand warmers. And Yoli drops the hand warmer and it lands in the snow and it melts part of the snow. And then they see Gomamon's eye in the snow. And they dig Gomamon out, and Joe's got Gomamon. And they, they're all sitting around a fire trying to warm Gomamon up so he's not sick. Human medicine apparently kind of seems to help Digimon at times as well. And what happens is, of course, Joe is very happy to see Gomamon again, and they end up having to, of course, they have to fight the Digimon Emperor. And I try to remember, Joe and Cody kind of stay behind. Armadillomon, of course, with Cody, and Gomamon with Joe, because Gomamon's still healing. They're there, and they kind of stay behind because, Gomamon can't Digivolve anyway, so Cody kind of, I think, stays behind, because he also easily catches a cold, because they end up dealing with a whole bunch of Frigimon at one point, and, Joe is, Cody catches a cold, and, Joe's, watching over him, and they end up, the others go and deal with the Control Spire, and then, of course, Cody Digivolves because they end up having to fight Shellmon again. And there's a couple of other things that they end up having to deal with. And Joe, I do believe at some point does, I do think Gomamon does Digivolve into Ikakumon, and helps, after the rest of the Digidestin are able to destroy the Control Spire, of course, because you can armor Digivolve around the Control Spires, but you can't regular Digivolve around the Control Spires, because that's just something that Ken built into the system as, part of the system when he was building the Control Spires as a Digimon Emperor, which, I mean, a good forethought on his part. I mean, I'll give him that. I mean, I don't like what he did as the Digimon Emperor, but you gotta give the man credit in the fact that he's like, well, if they're Digivolving, they can destroy the Control Spire faster, so I don't want that. So, you gotta at least give him credit there. And Joe, of course, Gomamon promises Joe promises Gomamon, of course, that he'll come back and, of course, protect him anytime that he needs to, that he'll come back and help. And Gomamon promises that he'll protect this area from the Digimon Emperor. And then later on, still before they deal with where they defeat Ken from being the Digimon Emperor, they end up in this like underwater oil platform type thing in one of the episodes. And this is actually the episode where Cody gets the Digi-Egg of Reliability. And what ends up happening is, the rest of the group are, the rest of the, the new group are, all the whole group are in the oil tank, or the oil platform. And what ends up happening is they kind of get stuck there because they're being attacked by Mega Seadramon. And what ends up happening is they find like an escape pod, but it's only big enough for one of them. So they basically trick Cody into having to get into the escape pod, and they send him off back to the surface, and they say, okay, you have to go to the real world, you have to find Joe, and you have to have him bring Gomamon or a Kakumon here because Kakumon can swim and then he can fight Megaseedramon because they're trapped inside of the oil platform and they're running out of oxygen. And they know that they're on the platform because they know that there's another Digi-Egg on the platform, another armored Digi-Egg on the platform, and that's what they're trying to find. And Cody ends up, of course, going back to the real world, and he's trying to think of like, well, he's like told by his, he's told by his grandpa so many times, like, you're not supposed to lie, and that lying is wrong. And Cody ends up at the place where Joe's doing his cram school, and Cody just basically, and Cody kind of go against his, he knows that his friends are hurt, that his friends are probably going to run out of oxygen at some point soon, and that he needs to get Joe, and he basically lies and tells him, well, Joe's father is ill, and Joe needs to get out of this important exam because his father's sick, type of thing. And Cody's so crushed that he has to go against his ideals, and I'll go over that in Cody's video, of course, when I get to Cody. But Joe gets out of the exams, and Cody explains that no, your dad's not dying, but there's a problem going on in the digital world, and we need you, and blah 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 with everything that's going on at the oil platform and everything. And Joe's like, okay, well, calm down. Gets on his phone, calls Izzy. He's like, okay, Izzy, I need you to do two things: find me Gomamon, or find me Gomamon, and find me Waymon. And they get back to the rest of the group are almost out of air at the oil platform, and this is when Waymon shows up, and when Ikakumon shows up, and Ikakumon starts fighting Megaseedramon to like chase it off, and Waymon just kind of like bashes his head into the oil rig and like opens his mouth inside, and Joe and Cody and Armadillomon pop out, or just Joe and Cody. I think, I don't remember if Armadillomon was with Cody or not. I don't think so because I don't think he fit in the escape pod. But Cody is still just kind of upset with himself that he had to lie to save his friends. And he, because he was told so often, by his mom and his grandpa that he's not supposed to lie, that lying is wrong. So it's, Cody's still dealing with that inner turmoil, and of course Joe and the rest of the group, get inside of Waymon, because they can travel inside Waymon's mouth, because they did that before a long time ago, and obviously this means that Waymon got reborn, which is good. I don't remember if they ever actually show Pixiemon again. I don't remember. I think they might show Pixiemon at some point in the series, but I don't remember if they actually show him again or not. But the rest of the group get into Waymon after they show Cody and Joe the Digi-Egg of reliability that they found, because they kept kind of digging in the platform and they found the Digi-Egg, and they're like, they all tried picking it up, and nothing, none of them could pick it up. And Joe tells Cody, or he assures him that, okay, your friends are alive because you had to tell one white lie to save your friends' lives. That doesn't mean that you're not honest and that you're not reliable. And that helps Cody. And, Joe tells Cody to pick up the egg, and Cody picks up the egg. And then this is Cody's like, well, I'm not reliable at all. I had to lie. And that's when Joe tells him, a little white lie to save your friends' lives does not make you unreliable. There is a difference between a horrible, facetious, lie that's meant to hurt people, and a little white lie that can actually save some people's lives. There is a difference there. And Joe kind of, at some point, I think when they were originally in the digital world, he kind of had to deal with that at some point, or in the past 2-3 years or so, he's had to deal with that. And so Cody then gets the Digi-Egg of reliability, and he gets Marimon, who I'll go over in his video, and him and Ikakumon fight against Megaseedramon, and they free him, and they then Cody gets to get over his fear of the ocean, of course. And then of course they have the anniversary for when they defeated Myotismon, and Joe is of course at that anniversary. And he's able to, help, he gives them encouragement in regards to, helping to deal with Ken, defeating Ken with kindness, and he gets to see Wizardmon, of course, when Kari and Gato want to see Wizardmon at the TV station. And later on, Joe's brother pops up when Yoli's class trip goes to Kyoto, and she meets Joe's brother Jim. and Sora's father, and I'll talk a little bit about Jim a little bit later, but she meets them, and then of course at Christmas we have the younger Digi-Destin surprise the older Digi-Destin with their Digimon in the real world, and so Joe gets Gomamon, and they deal with they get attacked at Matt's concert, of course, and then later on, they have to, of course, where they do the Digimon World Tour, Joe and Cody get teamed up, and they have to go to Australia, and they end up meeting a boy there. His name's Hogan, Digidestin named Hogan in Australia. And they're trying to get rid of a control spire, and they save Hogan from being chased by all of these kind of water-based Digimon. And one of the things that they do to the Digimon just to like torture the Digimon, like mental torture, it doesn't actually like do anything to them, it's just to like scare them. Gomamon and Armadillomon and Hogan's Digimon Crabmon, Crabmon because he's Australian, are there, and what ends up happening is they like taunt the other Digimon that are there by like talking about turning them into like so many different types of dishes, like pizza and calamari, and because like one of them's a squid, there's like calamari and like shell and like blah 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 blah, and like put hot sauce all over them, and it's just funny that they just like torture them that way, and then they have to protect the Great Barrier Reef, and they have to destroy control spires and everything, and Joe of course gets the ability to have Gomamon turn into Zudomon again. And then of course later on, they deal with a whole bunch of different the Digimon there in Australia, of course, and becoming Digimon seafood, as I said. And then they deal with that, and it's just kind of a funny sequence. It's one of the funnier sequences in that Digimon World Tour segment. And what ends up happening is, of course, then later on, Joe and the rest of the group, of course, they go back to the summer camp when everything is going on with Oikawa and the Dark Spore children. They go back to the summer camp, and then of course they travel to the digital world via their bonds with their Digimon, because Gomamon and the rest of the original Digi-Destins group have traveled to where the battle with Melamiotismon is taking place, and brought a whole bunch of the other destined Digimon with them. And then of course the Joe and the group that were at the summer camp travel there, and then of course they all use their Digi-Destin, their lights, in order to defeat to weaken Myotismon so they can defeat him. And what ends up happening is after that, of course, they defeat Melamiotismon, and then in 2003, there's, of course, the whole bit with Armageddonmon, with, Diaboromon's Revenge. And at the beginning of it, Joe is trying to find, like, his chances of getting into, the college that he wants to go to. And partway through the movie, Matt or Davis and Ken are trying to get to where this battle's supposed to be, get to the harbor where Armageddonmon's going to appear, and Joe shows up and he has a bike, and he's like, "I brought you a bike," and they're like, Davis is just like, "That's great, Joe, but there's two of us," and there's someone else that like rides by on a bike, and he's like, "One moment," and he chases after the girl, and I don't know if he like steals her bike, or if he's just like, "We really need your bike right now and I'll pay you," type of a thing. I don't know exactly what happens, but he gives the bike to Davis and Ken, and like they bike there, and Joe and the girl arrive at the battle, and like they see everything that see Armageddonmon, and they see Imperial Dermon Paladinmon and everything, and I don't think we ever find out who this girl is. I don't think we ever do. But she's there. It's safe to assume that Joe got into the college, or whatever the high school it was that he wanted to get into. And he's because by the time Digimon Tri rolls around, in the first episode, Joe's not very prevalent in the first episode. He's like studying for his college entrance exams. And stressing, of course, about falling behind in his grades, and he's very worried about that. He doesn't join the battle in regard at the airport when it comes to the Kawagamon, but then later Gomamon shows up and at Joe's apartment, and I don't know if that's like the Digimon have the ability to like find where they're their Digidestin is at any given time, or if it's like one of the rest of the group like dropped Gomamon off there. But Gomamon shows up at the window and he just like knocks on the window, and Joe turns and he sees Gomamon in the window, and Joe just kind of like rushes over and like opens the window for Gomamon and just hugs him. Because he's just like so happy to see Gomamon, and he cries when he hugs him, and you know he's just so happy to see Gomamon. And later, you know, the next day he meets up with the rest of the group a little bit. Joe, as I said, he's not very involved in the first episode. He's not super involved. Well, he gets more involved in like the second episode, but he doesn't do too much in the first episode. He doesn't go with the group when they end up meeting Mako and Mekumon in the first place, but he does inform the group that he has a girlfriend, and they're all very surprised by this, which is just funny. And my answer is it the girl that he stole the bike from and at the end of the Revenge of Diaboromon? That he like, I'll go on a date with you if you let one of my friends borrow your bike. I don't know, maybe that's how Joe got the girlfriend. But and then of course in Determination, Joe does not go to the spa day. Gomamon goes with the group, but Joe does not, and they sent him, you know, cute pictures of, you know, Gomamon because Joe's too busy studying. And he's very much he's too focused on studying. And you know, they talk about how Joe should have been there, and that, you know, there was this big battle that happened at one point, and that Joe should have been there to help, and like Mimi was kind of blaming herself for a bunch of the damage that was caused. And you know, Mimi, Determination's episode is kind of about Mimi and Joe having to face their darkness. And as I mentioned in the previous video with Izzy, Izzy gets the message that talks about, you know, to look into the darkness in oneself and beyond it is to find power. That, you know, to get past the darkness in yourself, to look into it and to get past it is to where you can find power. And the Determination is very much Joe and Mimi's story in dealing with that. Because at one point, Mimi runs into Joe, and Mimi's talking about the fact that everybody in so many of the girls in her class, except for Mako, think that she's a narcissist. And Joe is just very bogged down and burdened by the fact of, you know, his parents very much want him to, you know, he's supposed to be a doctor. You know, Jim didn't become a doctor. Jim went off to like study Digimon and everything, so you have to become a doctor type thing. And very much forcing all of that expectation onto Joe, and Joe is taking that onto himself. And Joe complains about how they have, you know, too much, you know, how that as Digidestin, they have too much pressure on them as being Digidestin, and how that keeps getting worse. And how sometimes it would just be nice if they could just, you know, just be kids again. Just, you know, just find out, you know, where he fits into the rest of the world, as opposed to, you know, he's a Digidestin, and he's also a student, and he's also a son, and he's a brother, and he's, you know, a friend, and he's a boyfriend, and, you know, he's like all this other stuff, and he has to be this, you know, this student that his parents want him to be. And you know, he wants his life to be his own, and that being self-centered is that better in regards to, you know, me being a narcissist, that being self-centered is better than being a coward, because Joe is being a coward. And on the way home, Joe tells himself that he's being pathetic for saying that. And Kari actually witnesses this conversation between the two of them, and she tells Ty about it. And Kari tries to get Ty to talk to Joe. You know, well, you're avoiding Matt, so go talk to Joe type of a thing. And you know, Gomamon keeps making Matt food, or keeps making Joe food while he's studying, and Joe's very appreciative of this at this moment. But at one point, Joe just snaps at Gomamon, and the next day he wakes up and Gomamon's gone. And I think like Gomamon left a note that said, you know, don't look for me type thing. And Gomamon goes to Izzy and Tentomon, and he stays with Izzy and Tentomon. And he like tells Izzy, don't tell Joe where I am. And, you know, Joe wakes up to find Gomamon gone, and he looks all over for him. He's like calling the rest of the Digidestin, and, you know, Izzy doesn't tell Joe that Gomamon's with him. And later, of course, in this episode, they meet with Leomon, or they meet Leomon again. And what ends up happening is, this is when it corresponds with the school festival. And, Mimi's doing, Mimi and Mako are doing the cafe with the cheerleading. And Joe finds out that Gomamon is at the school and he goes there. And there was like a costume contest that all the Digimon were a part of, and it was adorable. And Mekumon won. And then Matt gets slightly annoyed that Gabumon didn't win, which I'm like, okay, that's funny. I missed that in Matt's video, but I'll put that here. Matt's slightly annoyed that Gabumon didn't win this like cute and creepy type costume contest that they were doing at the school. But what ends up happening is, Joe shows up at the school and he's talking to Gomamon, and Joe talks about that he doesn't want to be a Digidestined anymore because of the burden. And Gomamon's like, well, if you don't need me anymore, then, I'll just go. And, Gomamon leaves again. And, Joe goes to, where all the bikes are, and he's getting ready to leave. And Kari shows up and she's confronting him. And she kind of ends up confronting him twice before Joe realizes what's important, because there ends up being a big battle that happens because Leomon gets infected, and there's a whole bunch of other problems that happen, and they have to start. This is where they have to start dealing with Mekumon, and a Dark Jedi shows up, and he's disguised as Ken, as like Digimon Emperor type Ken, for whatever reason, because he's got a weird narcissistic ability, I guess. And Gomamon tries fighting, and Kari tells Joe, Gomamon is fighting right now, and he needs you, and that he's forgotten the most important part about being a chosen Digidestined, about being a chosen child, is that the bond between you and your Digimon is the most important part, and that getting older won't change that you're partners for life. And that snaps Joe out of this like kind of a self-obsessed type of thing that he's been in for like the whole part of the Digimon Tri so far. And he snaps out of that, and he goes to where the battle is going on, and Mimi gets over her part of it as well. And I'll go over a little bit more of Mimi's in her video next. But in the next Digimon video. But what ends up happening is Joe is able to overcome that darkness. He looked inside that darkness that was inside of him, and he got past it. And he is able, then Gomamon digivolves into, Kakamon, and then Zudomon, and then he digivolves into Bikamon. For the first time, he reaches that stage. And, Mimi does the same thing with Palmon, and I'll go over that with her video. And they're able to defeat this fake Ken, and unfortunately they still lose Leomon in the process, and Mekumon disappears. Throughout the rest of the bit, throughout Confession, throughout the third movie, throughout Confession, Joe's much happier now. He's, him and Gomamon are on much better terms. He's, actually visiting the others at like visiting Izzy's office and everything. And he tells Gomamon that he has a girlfriend, and then he wants Gomamon to meet his girlfriend. And, it's like all the Digidestined, because like at this point in time, this corresponds with when all the Digimon start to realize that they're all infected. And, Patamon said that he's infected, and, it's just a whole bunch of them explaining that, that they know that they're infected. And Kari got possessed again, because Kari gets possessed a lot, and I'll go over that a little bit more in Kari's video. But Kari gets possessed again, and she like shows up and explains to the Digimon about the reboot that's going to happen. And so all the rest of the Digimon spend their days with their Digidestined. Kari and Gomamon go to a photo booth and get ice cream at the mall and do pictures in the photo booth, and Joe asks Gomamon to meet his girlfriend, and Gomamon's like, I have one question. Can other people see her? And Joe's just like, really, Gomamon? But so it's a lot of the Digimon. They're trying to spend a little bit more time with their Digidestin before everything happens, and they, when the reboot happens, because they won't be able to remember their Digidestin after the reboot, and they want to at least have a little more time with them before that happens. I'll go over Kari's possessions, various states of possession in her video, but they get through, and then that results in, of course, the whole event with the reboot happening, and with all the rest of the Digimon. Yes, they're all infected, and we get Izzy and Hercules Kabuterimon, and the big giant Digimon group hug, and all the Digidestin watching, and their Digimon are there, and they're all just they want their Digimon to be okay, but they know that that's not going to be 100% possible. And of course the reboot happens, and then they wait a little while, and they eventually all, they all go to the digital world, and they end up finding, they find their Digimon. They all get there, and they find the baby versions of their Digimon, and they're all rebuilding their friendships. Joe finds Bukamon, and they're able to start rebuilding these friendships. And at one point, one of the things that happens is, of course, they all get separated, and Joe ends up with, he has Palmon with him, and who's the other one? Oh, Joe ends up on top of a mountain with Patamon and Palmon, and then, as I mentioned, Gomamon is with Izzy and Matt and Agumon. So there's not too many of them that actually end up with like their right Digimon. Like Sora and Biomon are together, and then I think like Kari has Salamon. But I don't think there's too many others that actually end up with their right Digimon during this moment. And so they all end up getting brought back together at one point, and they have to deal with Dark Jedi, and they all get digivolving again, and they all get to their their whatever their mega level or ultimate level, whatever it is that they get to. And they end up going back to the real world at one point, and they all end up having to hide in the school. And Joe does something funny at the school, because they're all like locked in the school at night, and they're all trying to do like a scary ghost story. And Joe tries to tell a scary ghost story, but it's about like he got like a bee on a paper or something like that. And they're all just like, "Oh God, Joe." And then I don't remember who it is. I think it's either Dark. No, it's not Dark Jedi. It's Dark Jedi is not at the school. Sorry. It's either TK or Matt that tell like a scary story, and like right at some point, like this, when the scary part of the story is supposed to happen, Nishijima's there, and he opens the door, and it just freaks all the Digimon out, and they're all just like, ah! And it's just funny. But yeah, they all, they're all, they all have to call their parents and everything, and Joe calls his parents. Again, I don't know exactly what goes on with Joe and his parents. I'll kind of talk about a little bit about that when I get to Joe's relations, but they and then they all leave the school, and they all get back into the digital world at some point, and then of course everything happens where they think that Tai and Nishijima are dead, and there's this huge battle that's going on, and then of course we get Ordinamon, because Kari snaps because she thinks her brother's dead, and then of course we get the Ordinamon ordeal, and that happens, and then of course all of the they all end up back in the real world, and they're all trying to fight Ordinamon, and Kari eventually snaps out of her kind of depression stupor thing, and Izzy hacks Meikumon / Ordinamon and gets all the Digimon partners' memories back, and sends them back to where they're supposed to be, and of course they all digivolve into their final forms, and then into Omnimon Merciful Mode, where they defeat Ordinamon, and she's unfortunately wiped out, and then of course Christmas, they're also friends with Mako and everything, And we still don't ever get to meet Joe's girlfriend, unfortunately. And then, of course, we get into Digimon 2010 in the timeline, which, of course, Digimon The Last Evolution. And it's 5 years after, and Joe at this point is currently training to become a doctor. So he's out of high school, he's working his way through college, he's training to become a doctor. Wasn't at the battle at the beginning of the movie because he's working on becoming a doctor, of course, so he can't exactly leave his job to go and do this. Izzy does inform Joe probably about what Menawa said about the Digimon and their potential and their children, and how at some point the Digimon are going to leave again. And Joe probably doesn't like that because he kind of already almost like got separated from Gomamon in 5 years ago with what happened with Digimon Tri and everything, and he doesn't want that to happen again. Joe seems to be at a much happier place at this point in time, at the very least. But at one point, TK and Kari unfortunately end up in comas, and Mimi ends up in a coma, and Joe's kind of looking over them, and then Joe goes missing, and then they find him, and he's in a coma, unfortunately. And Ty and Matt, of course, and Izzy gets put into the coma, and of course Ty and Matt end up in the crystalline world that Menawa made, in the digital world where all the Digi-destined are in their little worlds with their Digimon, and she has kind of control over them, and Joe's there along with the rest of them, and she's using them to fight Matt and Joe, or Matt and Ty. And of course, Ty blows his whistle, and this wakes them up, and they have to fight Eosmon, and then of course we get the Agumon Bond of Courage, Gabumon Bond of Friendship, and they're able to defeat Menawa. And they all wake up, and Joe wakes up, and then Gabumon wakes up, and he's like, "I can't see a thing without your glasses." I love you, Gabumon. Love you, Gomamon. I love all the partner Digimon. Especially because there was a partner Digimon that I don't like. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of bugs, but I would still like to have, like, Wormmon from, Ken's Digimon. Or, I'm not the hugest fan of, blah, 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 but I wouldn't mind having blah, 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 from other Digi-destined. But what ends up happening is, then of course we skip to Digimon 2027 in the timeline, and Joe has become a doctor. He's a full-fledged doctor and everything, with a bag and everything, and he is like the digital world's first doctor, and he loves doing his job. He just wishes his patients would stop eating his tongue depressors. But he's like all the complications that occur with being the digital world's first doctor and everything. And in his family tradition, he has a son, and his son very closely resembles Joe, and he has a Bukamon, and Joe's like telling his son, just be careful, and try to stay out of the mud. And Gomamon just goes like, nah, go roll in the mud. So I don't know, maybe Joe ended up, well, obviously Joe ended up getting married, because I don't think, Joe does not strike me as the type of guy that's going to get married, that's not going to get married, and then have the kid. Joe does not seem that way. Or let's put it this way, Joe is very reliable, and if for some reason he did get his girlfriend pregnant before they got married, Joe is definitely the guy that's going to be marrying the woman and then keep, doing everything that he can to, keep her happy and keep the two of them together, because he is very reliable. So Joe would do that. And so maybe his girlfriend is the one that he ended up marrying, and that proves that she's real, because Joe is gay. Okay, now we're gonna move on to relationships that Joe has. So as his mother and his father, we see glimpses of his mother and father in Digimon Tri. His mother at some point chastises Gomamon for let Joe study. They expect him to become a doctor, and they later, much later, I'm assuming, they approve of him following his own path. Joe has, okay, so here's where the problem lies. Joe seems to have either one older brother or two, because in the translation errors, there is, or in the translations, he has one brother that's named Jim and one brother that's named Shin. And they're both his older brothers, but in Digimon Adventure, in the English dub, they are combined into one character. So, and the thing is that we find out that, because as I mentioned, and I'm just going to refer to him as Jim, because, well, there's like Jim, and there's Shin, and then there's Shu. And I'm like, okay, so, I don't know exactly what's going on here. So from my understanding of it is, in the English dub, Joe has one older brother. One. And that brother is called Jim. And in the Japanese, he has two older brothers. And they're two separate characters. And then in, and I'm just going to go by what I know from the English to the best of my knowledge. And Shu, who is Jim, I changed names, blah, 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 Jim. He was apparently over at a friend's house when the battle between Red Greymon and Parrotmon happened, or it would have been a possibility that Joe's brother would have also been chosen to become a Digidestined, which would have been interesting. And then 4 years later, when they were away at training camp during the Myotismon attack, he's there. But then, when when other things happen, when the Gomamon attack happened, Jim is studying in America, or he's studying medicine. And then he ends up going to an anthropology lecture by Sora's father, by Dr. Takanouchi, where he ends up then developing this love for, this cultural and the undefined and the unexplainable and everything. And then he works with Sora's father. We know later on that him and Sora's father end up working with Izzy, and Jim and Sora's father, Dr. Takanouchi, help Yoli in Kyoto when everything happens with what happens there with the Digimon bleeding through into the real world. And Jim was very supportive of what happens, and actually what ends up happening is when all of the Dark Spore children are kidnapped, and Ken kind of gets kidnapped along with them, Jim is there, and he actually helps chase the van with his own car, and he's got a bunch of the Digidestined, crammed into the van, or crammed into his car, and he's driving and trying to help them. And he's helping them chase the van, and then drop certain people off here, and then after they stop Oikawa gets what he wants, and then he lets the kids go. Jim then takes all the younger Digimon, the Digidestined, back home, and for some reason he lies to Kari's mom, even though Kari's mom is perfectly aware of Digimon. But when he drops Matt or Davis off at his apartment, June is there, Davis' sister June, and at this point June no longer has a crush on Matt, and June kind of develops a crush on Joe, or on Jim, which is just funny. And he helps them with gathering information during their stakeout on the Dark Spore children by helping, Professor Takanouchi and Sora's mom. And he's with the families when they go to the summer camp on December 31st, when all the Digidestined get whooshed back to the digital world. Although they also show Jim's other older brother, and I don't know if Joe and Joe's parents are there too. I don't know. But the only time that the two brothers are actually seen together. So I don't know what to tell you there. Translation error dub thing. We do know that at some point, between when the battle with Myotismon finishes and between Digimon 2020 and 2027, he gets a Digimon. Jim gets a Digimon. We don't know what Digimon this is. I think it's also stated that June gets a Digimon and that Yolei's older siblings get Digimon. Again, we don't know what Digimon these are. I will go over them a tiny bit when I go over the miscellaneous Digidestin later. But, Jim ends up joining Izzy and Dr. Takanuchi in regards to studying the digital world and, what they know about that and the human population and everything. And then we, of course, he has a son, and then, of course, we get to the rest of the Digidestin. Joe looks at Tai. He's okay with his role in the group. Joe's perfectly fine with kind of being the one of the caretakers of the group. As I mentioned, Sora is kind of the mom of the group. I would definitely put Joe as kind of the dad of the group. Joe continually worries throughout the series, but he gets more and more comfortable with Tai and Matt. He stays with Mimi when everything happens with Puppetmon and a bunch of that, and he's there with Tai when Joe and Tai have to help Mimi in the Princess Karaoke, which is when Mimi's trial during the time frame when they're all separated. After they're all separated on the continent of Server after the Edamon battle, which I'll go over with Mimi. But they deal with that, and then of course Joe and Matt, of course, were paired up at the restaurant, where Joe and they become great friends, and they have much better respect for each other by the end of that. And Joe looks up to Matt quite a bit, and of course later on, they have their different paths as well. Joe and Sora, Joe and Sora worked with the mind over matter art with defeating the Bakumon, and Joe and Sora really kind of got along fairly well even right off the bat. They're quite good with each other. Later on, as I said, Jim's brother Shu works with Sora's father, so there's that connection. And then of course, so they all work very well together. And then of course in Joe and Izzy, they're both some of the smarter ones of the group. They were fairly comfortable with each other, but they were both very standoffish as kids. So so they're not as socially fluent as the rest of the group, but they get along well. They're of course best friends by the time everything that happens in the second season. He's very protective of the younger Digidestin, of course, particularly Cody. And then in Digimon, and then when it comes to Mimi, Joe and Mimi were both, or Joe was Mimi's camp counselor, according to like some of the Digimon adventure novels, like before the series started. And then he takes extra responsibility for Mimi, of course, particularly as I pointed out during the arc with Puppetmon, where they all split up again, and Joe stays with Mimi, and everything happens with Saber Leomon, unfortunately. And what ends up happening is, of course, it seems to be implied in the Digimon movie that that Joe has a crush on Mimi. Although, as I mentioned with Izzy has a crush on Mimi in Digimon Adventure Tri. In this, Joe seems to have a crush on Mimi, but that seems to have changed later on. I don't know if Joe ever kind of finds out about Izzy having a crush on Mimi, but I would assume, Joe has his own girlfriend by the time Digimon Adventure Tri rolls around, so that's not really a huge thing. And then in, and then with TK, there's the joke that, Joe was voted most likely to chicken out in his school. Joe risks his life, of course, to save TK against Mega Seedramon when they're trying to get into Odaiba to go fight Myotismon. And, he's the first to understand that TK is able to take care of himself and doesn't always need to have someone there to rely on, to keep TK safe. Joe and Kari, they don't Joe and Kari don't interact with each other too much. You know, he's protective of her and takes responsibility for her, of course, throughout the course of the original series. And of course, later on, he understands that she's grown up and she can take care of herself. As I said with Digimon Tri, Kari is the one that confronts Joe in regards to the way that he's been treating Gomamon. And that he can't, you know, that the most important thing about being a Digidestin is, yeah, okay, so yeah, we're supposed to save the digital world. That's fine. But your bond with your partner is the most important thing. And, that is kind of what helps Joe get past his darkness in that moment in the Digimon Tri. And then, of course, when Joe interacts with Davis seems to be very respectful of Joe and takes, the wisdom Joe gives him to heart. Davis seems to be a little more open to taking the advice from, like, Joe and Izzy and, like, Sora and such than Davis was way back at the beginning, or than Ty was way back at the beginning. Joe with Yuli, his brother helps her in Kyoto. She calls Joe old reliable at one point. Cody and Joe develop a very good relationship in the fact that Joe helps Cody understand that there is a difference between a lie that is meant to harm and is facetious and is meant with bad intentions, and a lie that is actually a small white lie that actually helps people. And that's a very good thing that they do. Plus, they're paired up when they go to Australia, and they're very good there, and they make a very good team. And then, of course, there's Joe and Ken. Didn't particularly care for him as a Digimon Emperor, of course, but eventually comes to trust him and value him as a Digidestined. Relationships change with that, of course. Mostly everyone's relationship with, like, Ken shifts when he's no longer the Digimon Emperor, and I'll go over those a little bit more in depth, particularly when I get to the younger kids, and then, of course, when I get to Ken. So that's what we have for Joe. Becomes a doctor, Digital World's first doctor. Digital World probably could have used a doctor a long time ago, in all honesty. Okay, everyone, time for your hatch checkups at Primary Village. That would be funny. We don't know who Joe marries. Maybe it's his girlfriend from Digimon Adventure Tri. We don't, as I said, we don't know who Ty marries, or Mimi, or Izzy, or Joe, or TK, or Kari, or Cody, or the rest of them we know. But we don't know who they marry. I'll probably mention this in a Mako's video, but I would be okay if, like, Ty married Mako, because they seem to have a little bit of a bond. Digimon Tri, I would have been okay with that. I don't know if that's the case or not. As I said, I wouldn't mind if, like, by 2027, like actual 2027 in our timeline, if 6 years from now, if, like, Digimon came out with, like, just like one final OVA type thing that we're gonna do for Digimon Adventure that shows this is how Matt and Ty get Agumon, how they get their Digimon back, and how they're all gonna they all get their kids and they all get married and everything. Maybe they'll do that. I doubt it, but I would love it if they did that. That would make me very happy. But that's what we got for Joe. Next up will be Mimi and her Crest of Sincerity. Given the fact that Mimi's Digimon is a plant that turns into a cactus, that turns into a fairy, that turns into a rose dominatrix. I will probably have flowers back here, but that's what we got. I thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye. You guys are completely making me lose my appetite. I mean, come on, jelly beans and cherries on eggs. That's just crazy talk. Salt and pepper is all they need. Keep it simple. That's always been my motto.